And hello, I'm alerted that this Hangout on Air is live. My name is Brooke Lester, and this is a Google Hangout on Air with biblical scholars talking this week about prophecy and the prophets in the Hebrew Bible. And this is in service to the Open Old Testament Learning Event 2015, which can be found at OOTLE15.net, OOTLE15.net. And I'm here with Nisha Jr., and Nisha is Assistant Professor of Hebrew Bible Old Testament at the Howard University School of Divinity in Washington, D.C. And I'm also with Brian Bibb, who is Associate Professor of Hebrew Bible at Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina. Hi, Nisha. Hi, Brian.
Hi.
Hi.
Good. This week we're on prophecy and the prophets. It occurs to me that for those who are taking the course, I've probably gone as long as I possibly can without having explained why we started with 3 weeks of the writings and why we're now heading into 3 weeks of the latter prophets, since that doesn't match either the canonical ordering of the biblical texts nor any understanding of historical sequence in any way. And briefly, the reason I started doing it is I used to teach in canonical order, Pentateuch, former prophets, latter prophets, and writings. That's the Hebrew Bible order, not the English Bible or Septuagint order. And I found myself saying over and over and ago in conversation with my teaching assistants, especially when we were working through the Pentateuch and maybe the stories about Saul and David and so on in the and the kings and the former prophets, I'd say, oh, if only they'd done the writings already, if only they'd already read Job, if only they'd already seen Ecclesiastes or the Psalms, and they'd know that the Bible is very comfortable putting God in a very sketchy light, and the Bible is very comfortable with presenting God as changing God's mind, or the Bible is very comfortable with presenting competing views about God that don't agree with one another. They would just be so much better prepared, to sort of ask the questions that we're asking them to ask or see the things we're asking them to see in the Pentateuch and the former prophets. And so, one day I was talking with a TA about that, and she was sort of like, yeah, so why not? Why don't you just do it? And so since then, I've tended to teach in the order of writings, latter prophets, and then former prophets, and then Pentateuch. And with the consequence that so two good things happen is that at least that I hope are happening. One is the one that I just described, and the other is a learner doesn't have to know. Oh, Sarah's trying to get in. Is that what I see here? Let's. Sarah, I sent an invitation to you. Maybe one of you. I don't know if either of you guys can text message Sarah. Or reach her by some means to tell her that she should have an invitation on her Google Plus page or in her email, in one of those two places. So, one being the one that I just described, and the other that you don't have to learn the whole gosh darn timeline and political geography of ancient Israel in order to understand the material, like you do to do the Pentateuch. If you're going to do JEDP, if you're going to do the composition history of the Pentateuch in any way, you sort of have to already know there's a Judah and an Israel. You have to know all these dates and things like that. Whereas with the writings, you don't have to, especially the way I teach the writings, where we don't really do Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles, because I kind of work them in later. You don't have to know much of anything. And now with the latter prophets, you just got to go back to like 722, and pick that up, and then pick up 586, and you'll pretty much be okay. And then when we get to the former prophets, we'll take it all the way back. So it just kind of is, I hope, a more forgiving way of picking up the history and the political geography around all this stuff. But yeah, the 8th century prophets.
We're on prophets now in my 2-semester Old Testament Hebrew Bible class.
Okay.
And as I mentioned in the past, the way that I do it is historical, then Pentateuch, then wisdom, then prophets. So prophets is last for us. And again, I do it that way in part to defamiliarize students who feel like they know a lot about the Bible already, especially the narratives in the Pentateuch, And now it's the end of the second semester, and it means that students already are familiar with the geography, they're familiar with the timeline, they know where we are, they've heard of these things, and we can dig in a little bit more. What do you do, Brian?
Well, I have one semester of the whole Bible. That I just go through the canon. And I have a one semester introduction to the Old Testament that is pretty much canonical, although I do spend some time on the history before I get into the Torah, because actually I'm intrigued by this idea that you guys are doing the history before you're doing the Pentateuch, because the way I deal with the Pentateuch is as an expression of the exile. And so if you've spent a lot of time in the exile, it makes it easier to then look at Genesis 1 and say, okay, how does this presume, that later context?
I'm always interested, when I took Intro to OT, and this wouldn't have struck me as weird at the time because I didn't know anything. Our instructor, and this was on a semester system, so we didn't have a, we didn't have a whole lot of time. And our instructor didn't even start with the Bible. He started with Thorkild Jacobson's Treasures of Darkness, which introduces the Mesopotamian, especially the Sumerian pantheon of gods, and goes at some issues around that. And we read that for at least a couple of weeks, maybe as long as 3 weeks. We really hung in there with that because there were some ideas around family religion and state religion and different understandings about the gods that he really wanted to immerse us in before we even got into the Hebrew Bible at all. And when you think about how you always feel like you're just really pressed for time, like how can we even do the Hebrew Bible in a single semester? Oh, there's not nearly enough time. But that was his way, and he was writing a commentary on Exodus at the time, so we spent gobs of time on the Exodus. And he was thinking about Job, so we spent gobs of time on Job. And then we just kind of worked in everything else around kind of those two, foci of an ellipse. And it was fine. I mean, that's the class that got me really excited about Hebrew Bible in the first place. It's like we were fine. And it's the kind of thing that makes me suspect there's probably a lot. I mean, there's certainly some wrong ways, certainly, I guess, to teach Hebrew Bible, but there seems to be a lot more right ways than one would maybe think right off the bat.
You can't do all of it. And so if you're just going to be picking and choosing anyway, why even have the pretense of comprehensiveness?
Yeah.
Just do cool stuff.
And do cool stuff that you're excited about. I think that it does rub off on students when you're excited about material and you can convey that, and sometimes they get excited about it too.
Mm-hmm. Whoopsie. Especially now when, we say, when people talk about the internet age and everything, we talk all the time about how it used to be that information was hard to come by. It used to be that information was something that someone had to bring to you. Some expert, especially an expert who had access behind the university library paywalls and everything, would get the information and bring it into the classroom and get that information across, and would do other things, right? Like try to spark critical thinking and generate enthusiasm. But certainly it was about getting information across that was not available to everybody. And now we live in this world where information is, like passing through our bodies all the time. Information is on the internet everywhere. There's no shortage of information, and it's really more about sifting that information and helping learners learn how to sift it and assess it and filter it. And so you would think, I mean, it seems to me that now more than ever, there's the opportunity to sort of be designing learning experiences in the Hebrew Bible where, as you say, Brian, you're not even trying to get all the information across, and where it's not even trying to get really so much about getting information across, except only that information that's going to put the learner in a position to go on to be a successful lifelong gatherer of information about this stuff.
Yes, in my class, I talk a lot about asking questions, and in my context, that becomes particularly important with students who have been told not to ask questions about the Bible, to just believe, have faith, accept what the pastor says or what your Sunday school teacher told you. So asking questions as part of being a lifelong learner is helpful, and students after my class have expressed that it's helped them in other classes and in other aspects of their life as well.
It's true of the prophets, just to bring us to that topic. I mean, I teach a one-semester intro to the prophets, and it's probably my favorite class that I teach. But you definitely, going into that, have to decide what subset of this am I going to do. And when we read Amos or we read Isaiah, what are the questions that we're going to ask together? Because you can't do all of it. You just can't. And so what I have found is end up looking very specifically at particular kinds of literary and rhetorical and historical questions, and so we're doing a subset of the passages, but there's an entirely different shadow course that could be taught with my exact same syllabus, depending on which particular kinds of questions you bring to those particular texts.
I love the idea of a shadow course. That sounds fabulous. It could be like the underground biblical studies, something taking place in a cave somewhere.
Where something's going on, where the real stuff is going on.
It would be like the like Bravo After Dark.
What do you, so like, I mean, and this, I haven't prepared either of you with questions ahead of time, so this kind of thing you might, kind of got to think about, but like, what's the big, what are like big ideas for you? Like, if you were talking with someone else and you're like, oh my gosh, on the prophets, on the 8th century prophets or on prophecy, like if they can just understand ... then I know they'll be okay in the prophets. If they can just get their heads around this or start asking this kind of question or whatever, then even if they don't learn all the stuff, I know that they'll be okay. They'll go into the world and not do harm, on this subject matter or whatever. Is there anything for either of you that is sort of in that constellation of stuff that's rattling around in your head when you're teaching the prophets?
I actually wrote a book on the prophets that should be coming out any minute now. And in the introduction to that book, you didn't know this?
How did I not know this? Yeah, okay, go ahead.
I don't know. Well, I finished it 2 years ago, and it's been sitting in the publisher's queue. They had other issues. It was one of these things where I was like rushing and then sacrificing in order to finish it, and then I didn't hear from them for 9 months. But a different issue. In the introduction to that book, it's called God's Servants, the Prophets, by Smith and Helwes. And in the introduction, I sort of asked myself that question. It was like, okay, and the book is for sort of lay readers and students. And, if you, like, what are the things, sort of threshold perspectives that you need before you can really do anything helpful and interesting with these texts? And in that book, the way I divided it up was pretty standard, nothing groundbreaking, but into historical, literary, and theological categories. And so when you encounter a text, you first have to ask, as best we can tell, when was this text written? Which might not, and there are more than one layer there, right? What's the implied setting of the original utterance? What is the setting of its editing and compilation, right? Those are both historical questions. What are the literary strategies and motifs and images used in this passage? I find that students, a lot of times, the biggest barrier is they just don't get the metaphors. They don't understand the poetry. Like, they just literally don't understand it. And so and the main problem is they're reading way too fast. So we make them slow down, unpack those metaphors much more carefully, look at rhetorical strategies. Who's the speaker? Might not be the prophet. Maybe is God speaking? Is the foreign king speaking? Are the people speaking? Who are they talking to? And then under theological category, it was which parts of Israel's tradition are they drawing upon and responding to? And do you see sort of echoes of the Pentateuch? Where do you see any kind of interesting textual relationships to some of the Psalms, or do you think that this is pushing the argument about who God is forward in any way? And those are three very different kinds of questionings, but I think that being a careful reader of any prophetic text implies that you at least have that, and then there are probably some others as well involving contemporary contexts. But in terms of just understanding the words on the page, those three things are, in my mind, kind of the threshold.
For me, one of the things that I try to convey is, as Brian was talking, the rhetorical context, the situation, who's doing the speaking, the audience, what's going on, what are the issues. And in part, that's to help students to understand that the material that we're talking about in the prophets is not speaking directly to their particular circumstance in 2015. So there's a context in which this material is being spoken or written or shared or acted out, and it's important to understand that rather than to take the prophetic material as being directly relevant and speaking to contemporary issues as if prophets are speaking in a sense of prophecy being something in the far away future rather than speaking to their present and more immediate context.
It's kind of like we talked about last week, where one of the characteristics of apocalyptic, and Daniel is a really good example of this, where when the book of Daniel speaks about, if you're looking at sort of that period during Antiochus Epiphanes when the apocalypses were being written, when it talks about the distant past from that, it's kind of vague. It's mostly okay, but it gets some stuff wrong, and it's kind of vague. And then when it talks about the immediate past, it's like really right on, and the immediate. And then it starts talking about the immediate future, and it's just like way off. Like that's not at all how Antiochus Epiphanes ends up dying. And then when it talks about the distant future, and that's what really is very similar to the prophets. When the prophets talk about the future, it tends to be the distant future, and in very general terms. That is, there will be these periods of like where Israel is undergoing these kinds of trials, and then Israel will be restored. There will be this kind of general sense. There's this general sense of, in the distant future, we anticipate restoration, and it might be depicted in sort of very specific metaphorical terms, or very kind of florid, terms, but the details are not, it doesn't say, and then China will invade Russia, it's not anything like that kind of thing. When you talk about the prophets, not that the prophets aren't talking to you, Dave Garber, who's not here today, but I'd written something down that he wrote once. It was something from some series he was doing or something, but he'd been talking about it on Facebook, and he had these 6 things that he tends to tell people, like in adult ed series, and stuff like that, just to start getting their heads wrapped around what we do. And number 1 was seminary is not Sunday school. And number 2, the Bible is for mature audiences only. And number
especially how Dave teaches it.
Especially how Dave teaches it. And and things like, comparing children's pictures of Noah's Ark to other less sanguine representations of Noah's Ark, where you can see like the drowning babies and whatnot. Number 3, the Bible is not a Bible, which I think he gets via O'Brien. He credits with, like when you see today, you're like, the Mac Bible is like your guide to like everything Macintosh, or the whatever Bible, the getting into grad school Bible or whatever. And these Bible, like this, when we say that says something about what a Bible is. Like the Bible is like the coherent and ultimate guide to accomplishing or understanding this thing. And Dave's saying, that's not what the Bible is. The Bible's not a Bible in that sense. And then number 4 is where I was going, is the Bible is not your Bible. And that's when he gets into talking about sort of context and history and stuff like that. And this idea that the Bible is not your Bible. They're not talking to you. Especially because when you start following that, it's like sort of like if you do what Brian says and start reading this material really slowly, the more aware you are that this is happening on a completely different planet. Like, I mean, not only are they not talking to you, but they're not talking to anyone like you. They're not talking to me. They're not talking to anyone like me. They're not talking to anyone I kind of understand. Like, we
and
talk
they're
about.
also, I'm sorry, they're also not talking to individuals by and large. There's a handful of oracles to individuals, but mostly it's a corporate vision. I think we haven't. Is there another week on Jeremiah and Ezekiel?
Next week is
Okay.
the
I don't want to get ahead of myself.
Yeah.
Yeah. To me, one of the key texts that I like to throw up is, "I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you, to give you a future with hope," or whatever it is in Jeremiah 29. And it's crocheted on pillows, but it's not directed to an individual. It's not talking about the kind of things that people assume that God means when he says, know the plans I have for you. He's not talking about your internship this summer, right?
Also, not every text is about Jesus.
Or really, I mean, in the sense, right, in the sense of who they mean to be addressing. Are any of them about Jesus?
Right.
I mean, that's me, So you go on, Nisha. What do you say more about that?
Well, again, in my context, a lot of my students come with generations of Christian tradition of interpreting prophetic material as the entire point is that it's to point to the New Testament and to be read Christologically. And so, again, part of my emphasis on the rhetorical situation, the literary context, historical context, all of those types of things, is to help students to see that there are other ways to read these texts, that you don't have to read them just using this particular type of lens.
Which, I mean, then, so when we get into meaning, right? What do we mean when we say a text means something? What do we mean when we say this text does or doesn't mean Jesus, right? And that for me is an opportunity that one of the questions I eagerly look forward to getting into every semester, and just sort of wait until it has to happen. I don't really have a set time to us to talk about it, but it's whenever it has to happen. Is how many meanings does a text support? Does every text have only one meaning, or does it support multiple meanings? Does meaning mean what the author meant it meant, or does it make sense when I say, "Oh, this text speaks to me"? Like how can I say at the same time that the prophets aren't speaking to me, right? They're talking to someone else, and at the same time say, just as earnestly, "Oh, this text really speaks to me in this way," right? And related issues. So, like, how many meanings does a text support? What constraints are put upon the meanings that a text can support? And Nisha, I'm especially waiting for you to smile when I say, and who decides, right? Who decides how many meanings a text can support, and which meanings are real or right or authentic or supportable or what have you? Do you all have a moment? Is there a moment in your classrooms where this kind of becomes the thing that we're talking about now?
Well, what I tell my students is there are lots of moments, and I borrowed this. I want to say Joel Baden maybe. Anyway, I tell them the first day of class, I'm going to cross a line for you. I don't know when that's going to happen, but for everyone in here, there's going to be a point at which I cross a line. And, I go on and talk and say things like, it may be for you when I talk about Isaiah isn't talking about Jesus, or it may be when I say we have no archaeological evidence for the Exodus, or when I say Adam and Eve are not historical figures. I don't know, but it'll happen. Trust me. And then a student will raise his or her hand and say, wait, what were you saying about Adam and Eve? And I'll say, oh, look, today's your day. Thank you. This is our first example. And then we go on. Because in part, I have to explain that I can't stop the class for each person to have his or her moment. Because everyone's going to have a moment, but we can't stop and process with you individually. So you really do need to come to office hours so that we can have a more in-depth conversation about the line that was crossed for you in particular. But we also talk about, in the terms of do texts have more than one meaning, a question that a lot of feminist interpreters ask, which is whose interests are served. So not just who gets to decide, but who gets to decide and whose interests are served by this particular reading, who's left out, whose voices do we hear, who do we not hear from in this. And so talking in that way helps us to get at some of that, but there isn't a particular day that we specifically address it because, frankly, it happens all the time.
Yeah, I often find that Hosea is the moment where I invite my students to get into what I normally describe to them as ideological criticism, because Hosea 2 has that well-known metaphor where, you know, oh, it's a marriage. God describes God's relationship with Israel as a marriage, and it sounds like something that, you know, would be, you know, you'd stitch some stuff from that onto a pillow, and then you read the actual story, and you see Hosea's argument, right, saying that, you know, okay, if you accept that Israel has a covenant with God, yeah, okay, and if you accept that that covenant is analogous to a marriage covenant, and okay, and if you accept that marriage is of such a nature that the husband is able to coerce obedience from the wife using humiliation, force, the threat of force, you know, even to death, oh wait, you know, well, wait, because Hosea could take that for granted. Right? Hosea was surrounded by hearers who would say, yeah, okay, I'm still with you, Hosea, let's go. So, and he would say, so therefore God is able to coerce obedience from Israel using humiliation, violence, and the threat of violence even unto death. And then, oh, I get it now. Yes, I see. We should not be worshiping the Baals. That's an argument that I find compelling, and that it's very clear. For most of for the circles that I tend to be in, it is very clear how that is not an argument that rings true for us anymore, and that it is clear to us. That's a nice, clear example of this is a model that preserves certain interests and suppresses certain interests. This is a model that preserves social structures and social hierarchies in a very definite way. And then that can provide, once you see it in those very obvious and clear terms in Hosea 2, it might be easier for one to begin seeing, you know, taking that question to other texts where it might be less obvious, and ideally eventually to every text, to take to every text the question of what social structures are being reinforced here, whose voices are served, whose interests are served by those social structures, and whose are suppressed, whose voices are being erased here, and so on.
It reminds me, in grad school at PTS, we had a colleague, I will not name him here, but we had a colleague who was very emphatic in seminar one day about submitting to the text and how important he felt it was that we submit to the text. And we got into it in class, and eventually he actually asked me to lunch to have a fuller conversation because he just didn't understand my position. And finally I said, you know, if I submitted to the text the way that you're talking about, I would be picking cotton. And when I said it that way, he said, oh, okay, now I understand in a very clear way what you mean when you talk about whose interests are being served. But before that, it seemed to him just a sort of a neutral statement that anyone would understand that submitting to the text was something that we all could get behind without really thinking through what the implications would be.
Well, I want to know which texts people want me to submit to and why, or want you to submit to and why. I mean, with the irony is that it's in the prophets that we find the most resources to be able to unpack these kinds of issues in society. So, for example, whose interests are served in reading the prophets primarily individually or primarily as messianic words and not paying careful attention to the way Amos just eviscerates their socioeconomic, judicial, religious hierarchy? And I mean, so if we're going to submit to the text, we need, woe to you who sit on the Sabbath and say, when will the Sabbath be over that we may sell our grain using false balances, right? Or, the text about people using money that they've made through unjust religious practices and then supporting religious causes with that money, right? I mean, there's a tremendous resource here for exposing injustice and inequality, and it's certainly of its time, but the things that are there are very often the things that people are very quick to read past on their way to those verses that make them feel a little bit better.
Well, the problem is that the stuff that you're talking about, like the good juicy stuff from Amos, where he really takes to task the whole system, the status quo, the way things are, people don't want that on pillows or bumper stickers.
I do.
You're probably in the minority.
Well, I love Amos. I mean, I think I actually don't do a lot with Hosea just because, again, I'm very pressed for time, and usually I end up bringing up Hosea when I do talk about Ezekiel 16 and 23, so I'll talk about Hosea in that context. But I make them read all of it, and we go through it in pretty close detail, and students are usually very surprised at what's in there and how pointed it is in its economic and social critique, and also the sort of intensity of God's judgment on these people. And it's extreme. I mean, I would say Amos properly read is as extreme as Job in its own way.
There was a couple of comments in the Twitter feed on our pillow stitching metaphor. And I wanted to bring, we won't be on the Pentateuch in this course for a little while, but I wanted to show one of the things I keep in my office, which is a pillow that has stitched on it, "You shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk," which comes from the law codes in the Pentateuch. And this was given to me because I was using the pillow stitching metaphor, and it said something to, in class I said, yeah, the Old Testament just doesn't have a lot of these things, except maybe like in the Psalms from time to time, of things that people are just dying to stitch on their pillows and keep in their drawing room. And I said, nobody would ever want stitched on their pillow, "You shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk." And I found that out, found that at my podium at a later date when I came into class one day. So never say never when you talk about things that people might want to stitch on their pillows or not stitch on their pillows. What God, I don't think what I'm asking about. On prophecy and today, I'd mentioned to both Nisha and Brian during the pregame chat the activity that I've got my students doing in this class right now, which is to be annotating Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail and analyzing it as prophecy. And where that was coming from for me is just sort of the thing that I think I almost talk about when we really just get started on prophets is, what is prophecy and what do we mean when we say prophecy? If you ask people, what is biblical prophecy? And they'll say, well, it's prediction. It's where the Bible says what's going to happen. It's where the Old Testament predicts Jesus. It's where the Old Testament predicts the end of the world and Saddam Hussein or whatever, but it predicts stuff. And I'll say, oh, so like if the people I'm talking to are very often seminary churchy folks of a certain background, and say, oh well, if somebody preached in chapel this week and you heard people saying, oh wow, so and so preached and wow, the message was really prophetic, like it was a really prophetic sermon today, and I'd be like, so does that mean what did they predict? What did they predict in that sermon? Do you think it'll come true? That's not what I mean, right? Because that's so there's this other meaning we're a set of meanings that we're walking around with the word prophecy, and people will so if we're going to talk about modern prophets, if we're going to talk about those whose message is in some way prophetic, and especially someone like Martin Luther King, who in his letter from Birmingham jail, whatever else he does in there, he does overtly, and that's why I choose this piece, he overtly aligns himself with the 8th century prophets specifically, who go about with their "Thus says the Lord" message. And my students are just getting started on that, but I wondered, Nisha, you and Brian, do you have analogous conversations about these different ranges of meaning that we talk about with prophecy, and trying to sort of pry them up with a screwdriver and be attentive to them instead of them just sliding by, right? These assumed understandings of what prophecy are, which can sometimes cause people to, sort of be talking past each other about prophecy and the prophets. Maybe not.
I think using other forms in that way to sort of try to maybe identify similarities, and you distill down, like, well, what are really the key elements here, and do comparisons. Something that I often will do, and I sometimes get in trouble for this, is there's a video for a Pearl Jam song that came out in around 1998, and for a while I used it and it was new, and then I had to stop because it was cliche, and then I can use it again because now nobody knows it anymore. But the song is called "Do the Evolution." Have you seen that video? It's a cartoon. Oh, it's fantastic. So it's a cartoon that traces the history of evolution of life, starting with the organisms, little cells, all the way up through animals, and the history of mankind, and then the last thing that happens is complete nuclear destruction. And he uses this concept of evolution as, we assume that evolution means progress, and basically the idea is that everything stays the same. It's the triumph over the strong over the weak, but we are just getting more and more powerful in our ability to destroy the weak. And the comparison is that it's a cartoon, so it's using a cultural form that is a known quantity, but subverting expectations using that cultural form. The prophets do that kind of thing all the time. It's using an idea like evolution that people know about and reversing it and turning it into a kind of wedge of judgment speech. And then it's also sort of presenting a vision of destruction. It doesn't mean this is what's coming, it means this is what we are headed toward. And so there's an implied, what are we going to do about this? Is there anything that we can do about this? How am I responsible for the course in which things are moving? And it's a rock song. And so sometimes I'll have the professor from next door peeking in the window, sort of asking me to turn it down because you got to crank it. But I think using things like that help people understand prophetic speech as cultural critique, as rhetorical utterance, something other than this pious, sort of reverent, known quantity, right? There's something slippery and destabilizing about the text if you can just sort of see it for what it is.
In my class, we also look at the letter from Birmingham jail alongside of Amos and consider uses of language, how King uses biblical text, how he uses metaphor, figurative language, and talking about the differences between the King that comes across in this particular work versus the King that maybe we see in commercials, or the King of the sort of generic Black History Month spots.
Elementary school Black History Month handouts.
Right. King on a postage stamp. So talking then about the importance of understanding his particular context and how he's addressing that.
I like the way, I mean, and I don't know whether this is something that King would be doing at all in his letter, although I'd be really interested in looking at it and asking the question or hearing what others have to say. But when Brian was talking about the reversal of expectations, I don't know how much people, and this maybe goes back to like blah blah blah, fill in things that we've said before here and elsewhere about a liberal arts education as an excellent grounding for biblical studies, but recognizing genre as a thing that exists and as a thing that happens. This goes back again to Brian talking about reading slowly. If you're reading the prophets, or really, let's just say anything, just about anything that's written with intent, anything that's written with craft, to read it quickly for the gist is just a disaster. What's required is to slow down and to really let the words and the phrases work. And you can talk to people about and say, and help them see where genre exists in their life, right? So there is an epistolary formula in our life. Love letters fit the epistolary formula. Eviction letters fit the epistolary formula. Advertising mailers, dear occupant, dear friend, my loving wife, all have that salutation, and they have a body and they have a signature. And then you can look at subgenres, among these. Romantic comedies. I guess, like what would it be like if you were watching a movie that you went in and it set you up for a romantic comedy with a man and a woman who initially hate each other, and they've got their sassy friends, and but they get thrown together, and you're all set for what's going to happen. And then if the movie just took a hard left turn and just went someplace else and became like a Friday the 13th, or became a political satire, or became almost anything else, right? Something that upsets your expectations, which the prophets do all the time, and especially with the goal, and then really what the prophets are doing there is inviting the active participation of the hearer, right? That is, when you subvert an expectation, your hearer stops nodding their head and going, yeah, I hear you, and starts going, wait, what? What did you just do? I'm not sure about this.
And that's a really good point that I try to bring up with students about this issue of genre, that you have to have an audience that has this expectation. The audience has to understand the genre, know what they're being set up for. They should be nodding along with you before you make the turn, or before you say, but wait, this is different, and that's why. So understanding the context and the audience becomes all the more important, because otherwise you don't get it. It doesn't work for you if you don't understand the references. If you don't understand the situation, it just falls flat. So it's not communicating unless you're in on it.
So that's one way that the biblical, the idea of biblical prophets and prophecy, and the way we would talk in modern times about a sermon or a political message being prophetic, really does overlap nicely. That is, people today, prophets today, may not speak using the ancient Near East or biblical two-part saying, or the ancient Near East or biblical three things Yahweh hates, four he cannot abide, or this sort of thing. But they're both in the business of earning the hearer's trust and then betraying it in that way. That is, bringing the hearer in by appealing to their expectations, and getting the hearer comfortable that their expectations are being realized or met, and then betraying that trust and rousing the hearer in that way. The synapse, of the prophets, which I appeal to all the time, just because they're so gosh darn funny. as a way of getting people into just deciding to actually look closely at the prophets. It's like Isaiah ran around naked for 3 years. Jeremiah washed his underwear and buried it, and the prophets named their kids things like Abu Ghraib and Kent State, and or Twin Towers, or fill it in here, and which is just such a wonderful way of just if you walk around naked. I have to imagine that in the ancient Near East, just as here, if you walk around naked for 3 years, that's going to raise questions. And for the prophet, that is precisely the point, because once people are asking questions, perhaps simultaneously with jailing you or trying to stone you, or it kind of depends. But once they're asking questions, they're certainly engaged. I don't know what we have. People do things today that make statements, right? I mean, people will do things that make a statement. And broadly speaking, that, I guess, qualifies as sign act. But I think sometimes when, and I'm not thinking of anyone particular, and I'm not judging, I'm really just showing how little I've thought this through by being so vague about it, but that it's one thing to take an action that makes a statement, but not every statement is designed to elicit questions. And what would make it analogous, what would make an action analogous for me to a biblical sign act would be to take an action that makes a statement, and that statement is of such a kind as to, as Brian was saying, overturn expectations or elicit a sense of adherence to expectations, and then to betray it, and then to rouse questions in that way. But I don't know what that would. Examples don't come to mind, and that doesn't mean that they don't exist out there. It just means that I don't know them yet, or I haven't looked for them yet.
I haven't thought about this in this way either. So I'm just talking out loud with you guys. What about something like wearing "I Can't Breathe" T-shirt if you're an NBA player? So people understand what you're supposed to be doing there, why you're there, what you're there for, but this is doing something completely unexpected that might cause people to ask questions. Wait, you're muted.
If you're a basketball player, you are supposed to wear T-shirts you are expected to wear T-shirts with things on them. They're supposed to be, say, things like Nike, or in my day Adidas or Sprite or something, and showing up with a T-shirt that says something on it is adhering to expectations. And then when you read it and it says "I can't breathe," that subverts that expectation and upsets that expectation. You're supposed to be your body is supposed to be bearing advertisements right now, in my expectation, right. And instead you are bearing something else on your body, and maybe I don't know what that phrase "I don't breathe" means, because I'm not because if I'm not aware of that case, and so then I'm going to inquire about it, right? Or maybe I know about the case and I'm not sure what you think you're doing, right? Which was a big part of the response at that time. Why is it your place to be rousing
right.
this conversation? Yeah.
Yeah, so who are you to wear this shirt? I'm speaking of the Eric Garner case,
of course.
For someone who's not familiar, who says "I can't breathe" as he's killed by police. And LeBron James and other, I think it was LeBron. Which team was it?
I want to say it was
There may have been multiple. Wore "I Can't Breathe" shirts in the pre-warm-up, I believe. And that caused lots of conversation, some of which was, "How dare you? Who do you think you are? Just be an athlete, play ball, but I'm not here for this." So in that way, I think it functions as a sign act.
Now I'm thinking about, I'm going to start doing my students' homework for them. I don't mean to be doing that. I'm just rattling around with the idea of King's letter from Birmingham jail. I can imagine, depending on the reader and the hearer at that time. I guess I'm thinking of the people he was writing to, the 8 moderate clergymen that he was writing to. Writing from jail is a thing that they might expect of a prophet if they're thinking of like Paul, if sort of, and I think he invites that comparison in his letter. And what could 8 moderate white clergymen love more than Paul? But it's in that context of setting up an image for them that they are going to be inclined to be sympathetic to and to think of as a part of their world that they safely understand. This Pauline kind of, writing from a jail, but his message is one that they don't expect and aren't going to welcome, and so it's going to rouse them in that way. Just kind of thinking off the top of my head there.
I think it would be interesting at that point to look at a contemporary case of someone who is in prison and making an appeal, maybe some death penalty cases or something, because such time has passed and MLK has been valorized to the degree that when we see him in jail, right, that seems like the right place for him because he was fighting back, and it seems not right place that he's being punished, but that gives him moral virtue that he was in that prison at that time, looking at from our perspective. At the time, it was incredibly sort of shame-inducing kind of experience for him to be in that prison. And so who are the people in our context who are in a position to challenge our notions of honor and shame, who are being victimized or marginalized, and whose voices are being silenced because they're caught up in this system that is very often unjust? And who are the people who are helping to discover and amplify those voices and bring them into the public consciousness? And a great example is the death penalty discussion that's happened over the last week for the woman who's down in Georgia. And to me, one of the most interesting parts of that, as someone who's been opposed to the death penalty for a long time, is, well, why now? Why are we talking about this case? And how does this then translate to a larger discussion of the inequities of the death penalty, and what are all these other cases that we really need to go in and discover? So I think that Martin Luther King, in some ways, for the kind of students we get who tend to be, sort of moderate to liberal students, he's kind of a safe character in a way. And I think reading some of his works directly, you realize, oh, wait a minute, no, we've put him in a box, and he himself can challenge that. But I would like to push even further to say, let's talk about some of the people in our context who really do make us uncomfortable. And when Amos was walking around, he was making people very uncomfortable, right? There was nobody around who was going, yeah, I kind of take his side on this. He was an antagonistic figure. So I think we have to, and I'm not sure who to say, but I think there are some cases where we need to push even harder. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, I'm watching the 3rd season of House of Cards now, and I don't think this gives any spoilers away to say that Pussy Riot makes an appearance in one of the episodes in the 3rd season of House of Cards. And Pussy Riot, although they're jailed in in Russia rather than here, those might be some of the kinds of examples I might be looking for if I'm looking for someone who has not been sort of culturally had their rough edges already sort of culturally rubbed off and been sort of domesticated in that way, but is still as you say, all that has to happen for Martin Luther King to continue making people uncomfortable is that they read him, but to look for examples of folks who are currently making a lot of people really uncomfortable. What about, there's a question that was asked, if I'm reading it correctly, there was a question that was asked a while ago on Twitter about this thing that, of course, a lot of our students are avid readers of the New Testament. And what the New Testament does, this comes up all the time in class sooner or later, is that what we're asking students to do with the Old Testament is not what the New Testament does with the Old Testament by and large. for example, Matthew's fulfillment formula, where he's constantly latching onto things in the Old Testament that do not look like prophecy according to the definitions and parameters that we give students for prophecy, and declaring these things to be prophecy. Hosea 11, out of Egypt I have called my son. There's nothing in the context of Hosea 11 that says that in any way indicates that something like anything certainly like prediction is going on there. But Matthew doesn't care. Matthew, it works for Matthew, and he grabs onto it and declares that it's a prediction and so on. Do you all ever have that conversation come up where it's oh, okay, kids, and I guess this also comes up in New Testament classes. I'll hear my New Testament colleagues. I'll hear that my New Testament colleagues have said to their students, yes, we're studying what Paul does with Isaiah or what Matthew does with Hosea, but don't go to your Old Testament class and try to pull this on Lester because it won't fly. Does that come up with you all as well?
When you say Matthew and Isaiah, are you thinking about the virgin shall conceive?
I'm thinking of all of it. Like,
okay.
just take your pick.
Okay. Well, I mean, that Isaiah 7 and 8 is a great text to spend a half an hour on in a class, because you got those three children. Their names are fantastic, so we can talk about Maher-shalal-Hashbaz. I mean, who functions identically to Emmanuel in the prophecy. So some days I wish that he had been the one whose names had been picked up in the New Testament, Jesus. So then, can you imagine, Maher-shalal-Hashbaz, come, O come, Maher-shalal-Hashbaz. However, what's interesting is, as somebody interested in translation theory, is the controversy around the virgin young woman in Isaiah 7, which hinges completely on interpretive hermeneutical issues related to the Old Testament and the New Testament. So if you read it historically, there's nothing in that text about virginity. Right? Her virginity is not an issue in the story. She may or may not be. The word basically means a woman of marriageable age, kind of a maiden, maybe is a better word. But there's nothing in that text that implies a miraculous conception or delivery. And it's only in reading it backward, from the perspective of Matthew, that we would even sort of make that assumption. And so, in my mind, that's a really great example to say, well, wait a minute. If Matthew reads it, what from a historical point of view is incorrect, what do we do with that? Is it will we have to choose? Or is there some method by which you can read one way and then also then read another way and have those two readings existing in tension with each other? But it's the most controversial translation decision in the Bible. There were RSV Bibles in 1953 in the American South that were burned because of taking the virgin out of Isaiah 7:14.
This is another reason why I do prophets last. So by the time we get to Isaiah, they already pretty much know the drill. They know where we're going with this. They know how we're going to approach this. Still, for some, that's the day that I'm crossing the line. But they know enough that they can understand the arguments when I'm pointing out the translation issues there. So some of them still cling to what they've been taught in the past, but I ask them, can you at least understand the argument being made? If we can get that far, then we've learned a lot in this class.
Yeah, prophets is to Nisha as Pentateuch is to Brooke, right? So that's my rationale for putting Pentateuch last, is I've got us all striding with a quick, purposeful stride by that point. We're all kind of walking together and on the same page, and then my hope is that they've walked right into and are inhabiting the Pentateuchal critical issues before they quite realize that they're even doing so, and because they're coming in with the tools by that time after having worked through the other three parts of the Old Testament. But it is true, that is kind of a thing where some students, even at that late stage in the semester, where there are some students who sort of look around what they're inhabiting at that point and be like, yeah, okay, this is where I get off. This is where I don't walk with you anymore. But even if that's the case, I I think that's a topic to kind of come back to in other venues for now. Now I'm going to be interested in is what do you save for last? Sort of like people will save their favorite part of their dinner for last, and sort of treat it like a dessert before their dessert. What do you teach latest in the semester because it can be the most difficult, or because and in this case, I guess what interests me about that is that even if that's the place for you, Nisha, at the Prophets, or for me in the Pentateuch, where some students decide that that's where we've crossed the line, or not even us, but I mean it is, but where biblical studies has crossed the line, but at least we've established trust by that time, right? You know what I mean? Like hopefully at that point we have something like a community going on, to where that utterance that says, I can't really walk with you on this one yet, or maybe not at all, is not being said across sort of a chasm from one to another, but is being said within the bounds of a community that has had time to take shape and to develop, a community that's characterized by acceptance and reciprocity and trustworthiness.
Yes, usually that's the case by the time we get to the end, and most of my students will be students I've had for the 2 semesters, so they know each other, we have a community. Oftentimes they can already anticipate who's going to have a question about certain things, or who's going to raise his hand at something, and so by the time we get to that, usually they do understand where I'm coming from, and are at least willing to listen, even if still very much clinging to their messianic understandings.
All right. Anyone? We're at the hour. Does anybody, Nisha, either you or Brian, is there anything do you have a burning desire to get something in there on the Prophets before we break it up here?
We didn't talk about oral recitation. I think if you want to understand the Prophets, you need to get a group of people together and then shout it at each other, and then hear the oral aspect of it.
And that's going to raise huge questions when you do that, because as you said, these are my words, not yours, but you talked about this, Brian, where like reading the Prophets, I say this a lot about 2nd Isaiah especially, but reading the Prophets a lot of times is like reading a play where somebody has gone and cut out all the stage directions and all the parts where it says who's speaking when. The speaker is very often shifting between the prophet and God and opponents and who knows what, and that whole left-hand part of the page of the play where it says who's speaking has been chopped out, and so you find yourself having to ask a lot of questions in such an oral recitation. I mean, is that right, Brian?
Yeah, and so much of it is in the tone. So is it angry? Like, I mean, Jeremiah especially, right? When he's saying certain things, is he angry or mournful? Mm-hmm. Is he exasperated or sort of curious? I think there's a range, and we're filling all that in our head, and the Bible is sort of trapped in a kind of display case, Mm-hmm. Like we can't really get in there and really explore it because it has to be separate. It has to sort of be its own thing, and we aren't allowed to really play around with it. So I like to break it up and sort of let people just sort of dive into it in ways that they've never done before, in oral delivery, dramatic presentation, retranslation, secondary translation, where they do a new translation based on the English, mm-hmm. right? Secondary translation and paraphrasing, dynamic reformulation of metaphors. Yeah. To me, these are tools that we can use in group reading and probably also individual reading, but that we can use these tools to really kind of get inside the Prophet's rhetoric a little more authentically.
That's really interesting. And humor, right? I mean, most folks won't even, we're not trained to even look for humor in the Bible. And once people start reading out loud, like, will they find opportunities to try for the comic reading, and how will that work out for them, and where do those opportunities sit? Because those of us who spend a lot of time in the Hebrew Bible, we know those opportunities are totally there, but they don't leap from the page, especially when you read silently. That's absolutely the case. All right, good. This has been Nisha Jr. And Nisha, you can be found. Nisha's writings, some of her public writing is available on Huffington Post. You can look for, you can search for Nisha Jr. on Huffington Post and find some of her public writing there. And she's also at Nisha Jr. on Twitter. And Brian is at BBIB, that's BBIBB, on Twitter. And I have
BrianBib.com.
And Brian, oh yeah, thanks. I forgot. And BrianBib.com. And I'm Brooke Lester. Some of my stuff is at brooklester.net. I also blog. I don't think I've mentioned it. I also blog at seminariumblog.org. You can find some of my stuff there. And on Twitter, I am Anuma Brooke, ANUMMABROOKE. So thanks very much to Brian and to Nisha, and also to those who chose to join us on Twitter and follow us and horse around there and send us questions and comments. And next week is the pre-exilic prophets. So like Jeremiah, Ezekiel, sort of the late pre-exilic prophets. And I don't know. I'll get back to y'all, but some other stuff along, some similar related stuff along there having to do with Jerusalem or whatnot. So I'll look forward to that. Thank you both for spending time with us today, and we will see all of you next time.
Thanks. Bye.